Hello, in this video I'm going to be returning to the world of robots and mechs, which, judging by some of the comments on the videos, many of you will be happy to see. So this is going to be my entry for the 2002 original Mecha Contest, and as you can see it's a mecha suit. So we've got like a pilot in the middle here, and the arms are going to be mimicking the motion of the pilot. So I've made this one quite manoeuvrable, and it can be posed in a lot of different positions. So I'll be going through the various processes that went into making this. This one's actually had quite a journey. This is actually an idea I had about 3 years ago, so I'm going through all the various stages of making this, so let's get started. So my initial idea for this was to use these RC car parts to create some pieces for a mech. I've had these for ages and I've been meaning to use them for something for some time. I really like the look of these. You know, some of these pieces could easily be shoulder joints, for example, or limbs, you know, and I think this would be quite a nice way of easily creating some mechanical detail and sort of form the basis of the structure for a mech. So I figured what I could do is use these as a basis for the piece, and then augment them with various resin cast pieces and pieces of plastic and various other found objects, things like that. So as you can see here, I've got like an engine block, and I'm sort of adding pieces of resin to this to create a basic form. I'm thinking this piece here could very easily be a mechanism for a shoulder. So the initial phase of this was really just building up a basic form of the mech using this engine block as a starting point. What I also have are these ball bearings, and what was actually quite nice was once I glued this ball bearing onto this arm joint, the resin would actually grab it quite nicely. So this actually was all push fit, which was quite cool, so that meant I could sort of hold its shape together. I could get a basic idea of where the piece was going. Now, continuing with my theme of using RC car parts for the project, I also got these pieces here, which are really nice, sort of, I guess they're engine blocks or gearboxes or something like that, but I really like the mechanical detailing here. Now, while I suppose in principle I could actually try and machine these myself, to be honest with you, it's much easier just to buy these pieces and then just make a mould so I can produce duplicates. So that's what I'm going to do with these pieces here. So as you can see, I've just built this section into a sort of a waist section. So I've got some casts of my RC car parts here on the sides, and that's where the legs will attach. Now, the eagle-eyed amongst you might have noticed that this doesn't look anything like the robot that I showed you at the beginning of the video, and there's a reason for that. I sort of got halfway through this. I've probably been working on it for a month or so, and I started thinking, you know what, I'm not sure this is really that good. I like the basic idea of it, I like the use of the RC car parts, and I like the detail and the sort of complexity of it, but what I was thinking was that this is really just going to end up being another sort of humanoid robot sort of just standing there looking cool, and there's nothing wrong with that. You know, I've built a bunch of robots like that, but I don't want to start repeating myself, and I do want to do something that's just a little bit more imaginative than just a cool humanoid looking robot. So I started thinking, well, what can I do that might be a little bit different, that might make my robot stand out a little bit? And my thoughts turned to an idea that I had several years ago that I'd actually started making and then abandoned in a similar way to this. So what I wanted to do was to sculpt up a female figure in a sort of a sci-fi flight suit, maybe even a little bit like the rescue suit that I made a while back. You may remember this bust from a couple of years back. Now the idea was going to be that she was sort of holding her head in pain, or perhaps lifting her helmet off, and she would be wearing a mech suit, so there would be a pair of robotic arms mimicking that motion above her head. Now for many years I've had this mould sitting about, which is the mould that I use for the fingers for this blue robot that I made several years back. Now whenever I did some pressure casting, there'd always be a little bit of resin left over in the mixing cup. So because this mould really required pressure casting because it's got so many details in it, I would always pour that resin into this mould and then just whack it in the vacuum chamber alongside whatever I was pressure casting at the time. So what that meant was I ended up with a bag of fingers, and I always thought, well, you know, someday I'm going to build a robot which will need these, so I'll keep them to the side and sort of save them for that day. So when I was making this robotic sort of exosuit and sculpture, I was thinking, well, I can use those fingers for the hands. Now with this sculpture, as you can see, I went fairly far through the project. You know, I soldered up an armature for the sculpture, and I got pretty far into the actual sculpting of it. But where I got really stuck was the face. For whatever reason, I just couldn't get the face right, and I did it about 3 times, and every single time it just didn't look right. So eventually I ended up just giving up on the whole idea because I just couldn't get the look that I wanted. But I still like the basic idea of the project, so it's always been sort of lurking in the back of my mind that I would come back to this at some stage and have another go. So when I gave up on my original mech idea for this one, I thought, well, okay, maybe now is the time to actually do the mecha suit idea that I'd had however many years ago that it was. I don't think I've actually seen a mecha suit in the contest before, so I thought it'd be quite a nice way of doing it. You know, it's still a mech, it's still got all of those attributes of a mech, it's just the pilot is a little bit more prominent than it might be in any other sort of robot. So I thought that was quite a cool idea, and sort of, you know, something I hadn't done before. So that's what I'm going to go with. So basically I sort of swept all of this to the side. I might come back to the original mech idea that I had. I do like the look of it, it's just, you know, at the minute it's not really grabbing me. So I decided to start again from scratch, so that's what I'm going to do here. Now the key idea for this sculpture that I had originally was that the robot suit would be mimicking the motions of the pilot, and originally I had the idea that she would be taking her helmet off and sort of holding her head, and so the hands would be above her mimicking that motion. Now I quite like that idea, but I started thinking, well, maybe I could do something that's a little bit more dynamic. So what I decided to do was actually have a robot that's sort of like leaping across something. So here's an image just for reference. I want to try and replicate this sort of pose for the piece. Now obviously that's quite an extreme pose, so I'll need some sort of armature inside. So as you can see here, what I've got is some square brass tubing embedded in a block of wood, and this is going to be the support structure to hold the sculpture in place. So what I'm doing is just building up a basic hand shape out of these cast fingers and using some other resin pieces to hold that in place. And I've got some casts of my RC car parts in there as well. So there's a basic idea for a hand. So what I now need to do is make a forearm. So what I'm going to do is come over to the lathe, and I've got this large block of resin which I've just cast up in a cylindrical mould. I find this stuff really useful to work with. You know, it's very easy to carve and shape, so it's quite nice in the lathe for sort of quickly making shapes. So what I'm going to do is carve this down and try and get a nice tapered finish to it. What I'm initially going to do is carve some detail in the end. So the idea I'm going to have is that there's sort of a chassis over the lower half of the arm, and the upper part is exposed with sort of some mechanical detailing. So I'm just putting those shapes in first, then I can come in with a hand tool to try and get the taper. That's quite difficult to do on the lathe because the tool only goes back and forth left and right, so if you want a sort of a curve you really have to do that by hand. Well, there we go, so that's not looking too bad. But what I want to do is actually cut this down and have the inside of it exposed so you can see some of the mechanical detailing. So I'm just drawing a rough firm shape on the side so I can see where I need to cut. Now I could do this on the bandsaw, but I actually want a little bit more control over it. So I'm going to use these modelling saws to cut this shape out. I can now bring in the Dremel to sort of further cut this down as well. So I can now use some epoxy to put this further lathe piece in the centre as well. Okay, so it's looking pretty good as a basic shape. So now obviously I'll need at least 2 of these, so I'm going to make a mould of this and then I can cast up as many as I need. And I'm also going to make a mould of a further mechanical piece here as well, so I can easily produce some sort of cylindrical shapes with some mechanical detailing carved in. So I'm just going to fill the moulds with some rice so I can see exactly how much silicon I need. Now, something that I've been experimenting with recently, and I mentioned this in my videos on the sculptural bases that I made, I'm using some silicon which is a little bit different to the regular stuff I use. It's actually a platinum silicon, and it's much softer than the regular stuff, and I'm sort of using this more for sort of long, thin, cylindrical objects. I think it's much easier to get them out of the mould because the mould can flex that much more. So I'm going to use that here because I think what I'm going to be able to do is actually get the piece out of the mould without having to cut the mould. So that's quite useful because it means I'm not going to have any mould lines on the piece. Okay, so I've left that to set and I can now try and demould my pieces. Okay, so the first part has come out quite easily, so that bodes well for the larger piece. Okay, not looking too bad, so I can now try and cast some pieces. Okay, that's looking pretty good. There are some bubbles on the surface detail. I'm not quite sure why they're there because I did degas the silicon before I poured it in, so there shouldn't be any sort of air bubbles in the silicon itself. Nevertheless, it's fairly easy to sand them off, so not too big a deal really. Okay, what I also need to do is make a elbow joint, and so what I've done is to make some further cast resin pieces. So as you can see here, I've just made these pieces out of some acrylic and some washers, and I've made another mould of those so I can produce as many of these as I need. I've also made this sort of interior piece as well, so that's going to help me form a joint for the elbow. What I also did was to make a mould of some servo arms, so I just bought a bunch of these off eBay with various shapes and sizes. So I've got one mould with I think about 3 or 4 different versions of these, and whenever I have some spare resin I just pour that into the mould. So I've got a bunch of these and they've got some really nice mechanical detailing on them, so they're going to be really useful. So I'm going to cut these up and use these to add some additional detail to the pieces. Okay, so there we go, so that's not looking too bad. Looks like a recognisable arm, I think, so it's a good start. Now I also want to have some piston detail on the back of the arm, on the upper arm, and so what I'm going to do is use this piece, which is something that I made for my Demon Mech from last year. I've still got the mould, so it's quite easy for me to reproduce these, so I'm going to use that to add some additional mechanical detailing. And hopefully you can sort of see how that's going to look. So now I've got a basic arm shape in place, I need to start thinking about a shoulder joint. And what I was thinking is I could just use some more cast resin pieces here and sort of make a junction like that, you know. But I started thinking, well, maybe I can be a little bit more imaginative here, do something a little bit more interesting. So I'm going to turn back to an old favourite, which is a cupboard door hinge. You may recall I used these on my 3-legged mech a while back, and they were quite cool, you know, they look pretty good for a leg. And they save you a hell of a lot of time just because they've got so much detail in them already. You can kind of use them as a sort of ready-made piece. So I thought maybe this would be cool for a shoulder mechanism. So it might look something like that. Problem with this though is they're sort of spring loaded, so what I need to do is pull out the sort of spring bit just so this doesn't snap into shape and potentially sort of launch the arm across the room. So what I'm going to do is grind away this piece so I can sort of pull the pivot out and get that section out. Okay, there we go. So now that piece will just move smoothly and it won't snap into shape. So that's pretty cool. So I just need to quickly get rid of some of these screw brackets as well. So I drilled a hole in that and put a screw through, and I've got a chunk of acetal there which is attached to the arm, and as you can see, the arm can now sort of move up and down and sort of pivot back and forth quite nicely there. So I actually really like the motion of that. I think that looks pretty cool, and obviously there's quite a nice amount of mechanical detailing in there as well, so I think that's going to look pretty cool. So I've got a basic idea of what the arms are going to look like, so I can now start thinking about what the pilot is going to look like. And what I've done here is to print out a diagram of a figure, just so I've got something to guide me. Now what I've decided to do here is actually use some stop motion armatures to create the figure. Now there's a reason for this. Because I want to have the model in quite a dynamic pose, I started thinking about, well, if it's stuck in that pose, that might prove problematic. Primarily because I don't really have that much space to actually display these things. So if it's like sort of leaping over something, that's going to take up quite a lot of space. And it would be quite nice to display it, but it would also be nice if it was a little bit smaller. So I started thinking, well, what if this model could actually be reposed in sort of whatever shape I want? So to that end, I've started building the robot with the idea that it can move and be posed. Now, what I was initially thinking was that I could perhaps use a 1/6 scale action figure for the figure that's going to be the pilot, and that possibly would have worked well enough, but those action figure bodies aren't always that strong in terms of the joints, and I wanted this to be able to sort of be posed and retain its position. I didn't want it to sort of slip over time, so I decided to buy myself some stop motion animation armature pieces, and they've got these ball joints which are really strong. You can tighten them with the screw that's in the joint there. So what I want to do is use these pieces to build up a armature for my piece, and I can then sculpt over that to create the final figure. These joints are all attached to M4 threaded rods, so you can build up sort of any shape you want with these really, so they're really useful. Now one of the problems with these stop motion animation armatures is because they use M4 threaded rod, you have to actually tighten it up, and if you move the joint in the opposite direction, that can loosen the joint. So you can imagine if you move the arm forwards, that might go against the screw thread, but if you move it back, that might go with it and thus loosen the joint. Now they do sell something called Loctite, which you put on the screw threads, and the idea is that that dries in the joints and sort of keeps it in place basically. But I have found that that doesn't always work, and it's not really that strong. So what I've decided to do here is actually try and use some solder and get that to flow into the screw threads and see if that will hold it in place. So I've just added some flux onto the metal, and that will allow the solder to attach to the metal. Now it took a little bit of experimentation with this. There seems to be a bit of a sweet spot just after the metal goes black from the blowtorch, and that's when the solder will actually attach to it and flow through. So it took a little bit of experimentation, but I have found that these joints are pretty strong once you get the solder in there. So that's what I'm going to do for this. Okay, as you can see, I've turned this into a bit of a black and charred mess, so I'm just going to take this down to the tap in the garden and cool it down. After giving it a bit of a go with wire wool, that actually looks a lot better, and the joints do seem pretty strong, so I think that's going to work. Now the stop motion joints will work well enough for the larger joints in the body, but because this is going to be relatively thin, I can't use these ball and socket joints on the elbows or the knees really, because they're just a little bit too thin. So what I've got are these barrel hinges. I bought loads of these for some other project, I can't even remember what it was, so I've got like about 50 of these, so I think these are going to do pretty well for joints on the elbows. So I can just use some brass tubing to attach those together. And again, I can solder this together as well. I'm using some square tubing for the lower arms, and that will allow me to have some detachable hands. I can then have the hands in a few different poses, and I can just swap them out depending on how I want to pose the model. Now for the hips, what I've got are these ball joints from RC cars. I think these are intended to be using on the steering mechanism. Now For the lower legs, basically the lower legs are going to be attached to the mech. So the legs of the mech are going to be posable, and the idea is that as I move the legs of the mech, the pilot's legs will move in harmony with it. So the legs don't need to have any tension in them, they can just move freely, but because they'll be attached to the mech's legs, that will hold them in place. So these joints will be perfect for that because they can sort of move however they need to. However, they have a slightly smaller hole than I need, so I need to file down this piece of M4 threaded rod just so I can get it to fit on these ball joints. Okay, there we go. So I can now actually start sculpting the figure up properly, and what I'm going to do is actually use some epoxy. This stuff's called Freeform Sculpt from Smooth On, and it's like an epoxy clay. And I've used it here and there, and it's actually been rather tricky to use because it's quite sticky. It does come with a smoothing agent that you can use to smooth it out, so it is usable, it's just a little bit tricky. So I've never sort of sculpted a full figure with it before, but that's what I want to try and do here. Now I could use Super Sculpey, but to be honest with you, that stuff's not that strong, so I think I'd be slightly worried about the sculpture breaking. So I figure if I make it in epoxy, this is going to be super tough, and that way it can sort of take any knocks that it needs to. So the way I did this was really to sort of do it in batches. So I do one batch, leave it for an hour or so to firm up, and then come and add more. Initially I just needed a solid surface to sculpt against, so I just sort of put some basic shapes in here for the torso and the hips, and then once they're set I can then come in and sculpt against them to sort of slowly build out the figure. So I've put a piece of square tubing in the back here, so this is just going to be a junction effectively to allow me to attach this to the mech body. So I'm sculpting this against the diagram that I have the whole time. That's just to make sure that I have the proportions correct. Because I'm sort of sculpting this in sort of separate sections, it can be a little bit easy to become unstuck and sort of do the hips too thin or the torso too wide, something like that. So I'm keeping the diagram there just to make sure I don't sort of go off the rails. Now what I also want to do is to use some cast resin pieces here to sort of create some sort of junctions effectively, so one for the neck and also for the shoulders as well. The idea is this is going to be a sort of a sci-fi suit, so having these sort of shapes in there I think is going to really help with that look. You can basically just push these into the clay, and then once it sets it will hold them in place. So I'm just moving on to the legs now and trying to get the shapes correct. This can be quite tricky because the thing wants to move about the whole place. It's quite difficult to sort of find a solid structure to actually sculpt against. But yeah, as you can see, that's beginning to take shape. Now the cool thing about the epoxy of course is that once it's dry you can start sanding it down to get a nice smooth finish. This stuff's really tough, but it sands quite well, so it's quite easy to shape it and get those sort of smooth finishes that's quite difficult to actually sculpt in by hand. I'm going to come back and layer in additional detailing on top of this, so this is really just a basic form at the moment. So now that I've got the figure in a basically recognisable position, I can now turn my attention back to the other elements of the mech suit and see how all those are going to fit together. So what I've done is to attach both of these cupboard door hinges to a block of wood here, and they're both also attached to a piece of acetate as well. I've chosen that just because it's pretty tough, so that way this is going to be quite a strong arrangement, and so it should be able to take some knocks and some strain. And as you can see, my figure can then sit in front of that quite nicely. So now I've got the arms in a sort of a fairly recognisable state, what I now need to do is turn my attention to some legs. So what I've done is to cut out some shapes in acrylic here, but what I want to do is actually bend these. A lot of mechanical shapes and things you see, often sort of moves in sort of interesting ways. It's not just flat plates of metal, they're often bent into shape to allow the piece to do what it needs to. So what I want to try and do is bend these pieces of acrylic to get just a more interesting shape. Now I don't have a heat gun at the minute, so I'm going to use a blowtorch, and what I've done is to get two pieces of wood here, and I've just covered them in aluminium tape, hopefully that will stop them burning. and I can just position them here to direct the heat to a particular point on the plastic. So I'll also heat that for a little bit and see how I do. Okay, that's not worked too badly actually, so I can now proceed and bend some other pieces as well to try and get the shapes I need. Okay, there we go. So that's not looking too bad. The idea of this bend is so that the pivot can be behind the character, but the knee joint can be in line with the knee of the pilot. You'll see what I mean once I put this together. So I'm just putting together some additional hands as well. So the idea I've got for this piece basically is it's going to do the leaping pose, and there's going to be one arm attached to the base which I can attach the robot to do that pose. I can then take it off the base, leaving that arm in place, and have a separate arm that I can attach to the same shoulder for standing poses. So to that end I actually need 3 hands, one that's going to be on the base with the leaping arm, and another 2 just for general poses. So all I've done is to build the body of the robot out further, as well as having the arms attached to this block of wood here. I've also attached a piece of bendable aluminium in the centre here, and that means that I can sort of position the waist of the robot however I need to. I've also got the acrylic legs attached to this using some more of the stop motion animation ball joints, so that means that the legs can be posed in any position I need to as well. As I mentioned, I had considered using a 1/6 scale action figure for this, and so the figure's made to that scale. So I actually have the sort of sci-fi boots that I was going to use for another project. I think I was going to try and make my own Star-Lord. I ended up buying in the end. So these boots go in spares, so I thought these would look rather cool on the model, so I'm going to use those. So yeah, so that's where I've got to so far. You can sort of see the basic shapes of this. I mean, obviously I need to build this out far more with more mechanical detailing and some sort of chassis to it as well, I think, just so it looks like a bit stockier, a bit sturdier. So there's a fair way to go, but for the time being I'm quite happy with how that's looking. So I think that's it. If you've waited this far through the video, thanks very much for sticking with it. There'll be more on this one of course, but for the time being, thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching. If you'd like to support the channel, then please do give us a like and subscribe and all the usual YouTube stuff. The more concrete way of supporting the channel is heading over to my Etsy store, which is the Sculpture Studio, where I have a variety of skull-based sculptures for those who are interested in such things. If you'd like to follow what I do, I'm also on Instagram and Facebook. Just search for The Dark Power.